we roll into the Fourth Doctor.
Mr. Tom Baker, who's still holds the record for the longest sort of running Doctor, sort of 7 years in the role, which is a long time. I think, the longest anybody's been there in New Who now has been, I think Tennant was there for, 4 years, I think?
Yeah.
Most people are doing 3 seasons, and Tom Baker stuck around for a long time. The thing to keep in mind about Tom Baker's Doctor is my buddy and sometime editor at the Doctor Who Ratings Guide website, Robert Smith, once pointed out, is the fact that there's not one Tom Baker era, there's 3. There's his first 3 seasons, which is sort of Robot through Talons of Weng-Chiang, where it's, the funny thing about his Doctor is that he arrives sort of fully formed in a flame, but he's growing with confidence with every story that they do. And it's a very sort of more serious era. It's quite gothic. You end up with stories like Genesis of the Daleks, Pyramids of Mars, Brain of Morbius. These kind of sort of slightly darker, more serious stories. It's Doctor Who being not completely grown up, but being slightly more grown up, and which got the show into trouble in many ways. That's there for the first 3 years, and for my money, it's some of the best stuff that Classic Who does. Is in that sort of era. Genesis of the Daleks especially is a favorite of mine. And of course that introduces Davros, who's, once again, another really important figure in the show. But somebody who's not introduced until the show is 13 years old at that point. So clearly how much the show is being made up as it goes along. The second Tom Baker era is his next 3 seasons, which is under a different producer who I think wanted the show to be slightly more kid-friendly. So it's an era that's a bit lighter in tone, that's a bit more jokey. Douglas Adams comes in to work on the show at this point and does, co-writes basically 2 or 3 stories and actually becomes the show's head writer for a year. But it's basically, Tom Baker at some point stops kind of playing the Doctor. He becomes the Tom Baker show in a weird way. Tom is basically playing himself. And then the third Tom Baker era is kind of his last year, season 18, which is sort of, once again, the show becomes a bit more serious again. There's a new producer coming in, John Nathan Turner, who will stay with the show for the rest of its run throughout the 80s, and who is kind of there to really kind of make the show a bit more serious again. There's a new head writer taking over from Douglas Adams named Christopher Bidmead, who's the polar opposite of Douglas Adams. It's, wants to inject real science fiction back into it. It's kind of a breath of fresh air in its own way. But Tom didn't like it. There's a sort of morose quality to him throughout that last season where he's, you can kind of tell he's being reined in a bit. But there's some great stories throughout that last year as well. I'm quite fond of the so-called E-Space trilogy where the Doctor and Romana and K9 end up in this kind of weird sort of parallel universe, where they also meet Adric, who's a companion who'll carry over into the Peter Davison Fifth Doctor era. There's a wonderful story in there called State of Decay, which is basically Doctor Who doing a vampire story. And it's really, in a weird way, an encapsulation of all 3 Tom Baker eras in one, because it's a funny behind-the-scenes story of it is it was originally commissioned for Tom's 3rd season, if I remember correctly, and got scratched because the BBC was doing a big budget adaptation of Dracula with the French actor Louis Jourdan playing the role, which is available on DVD, funnily enough. If you're a Dracula fan and you haven't seen it, I recommend it. So it got pushed back. But it features, so it's got kind of the kind of tonnage of that. It's got Romana and K9 in it, who are introduced in Tom's middle era, but it's also got a slightly more scientific, science fiction-y edge to it from that last era. So it's a wonderful kind of encapsulation of that. But yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's great stories throughout all 3 kind of eras. Genesis of the Daleks, I mentioned before, Pyramids of Mars, City of Death, which Douglas Adams co-wrote. Excuse me. Sorry about that. City of Death, which Douglas Adams co-wrote, where they actually went to Paris and actually shot part of the story in Paris. State of Decay, and of course Logopolis, which is Tom's final story, which was recently shown on the big screen and has never looked better, in my humble opinion. But Tom's era is important because, as we talked about at the beginning of the episode, it's the one where that was where a lot of, particularly the American market, was introduced. It's kind of the moment when Doctor Who, which had always been kind of successful in the UK, started becoming an international success. And it's really Tom's era that paves the way for the show's kind of underground, cultish success here in the US in the 1980s.
That was the first Doctor that I was aware of.
Yeah, I think that's the first Doctor, as I said, for a lot of people, particularly of a certain age. If you came to Doctor Who during the classic era, it was through Tom Baker. Which, I can remember that people would ask me that question about, oh, you mean the one with the guy with the curls and the scarf? And it's like, yeah, but he's not the one he's the one I was introduced to, but he's not my favorite. But it's kind of a funny thing. I mean, Tom, I guess by virtue of having been there for as long as he did, he, in many ways, I think is still the most popular classic series Doctor. Certainly, I think the one that's most associated with the part until New Who came around. I think at that point, people start thinking more David Tennant and Matt Smith.
Well, there's a lot of factors with why Tom Baker was so popular. I'd say, number one, sheer volume of episodes. Yeah. Also, the availability of seeing it constantly on PBS. That was the era of regular rotation. But also, the look of the character became iconic and so different, so standoutish, with the long scarf, always having jelly beans with him. There are certain things that made him a character in itself.
Yeah, the scarf, I think, is the big thing. I mean, there's, I think there's still, even now, you could put together a basic Tom Baker costume with that scarf, and people would probably know who you were. I mean, he showed up on The Simpsons and Futurama, for crying out loud, which I always get a big laugh out of. There's people who don't know Doctor Who, but they will recognize Tom Baker as a character, Tom Baker's Doctor as a character from other things, just because of how much he was featured in things. But the scarf's a fun one because that's actually a complete accident of production. They sent a bunch of wool. They decided they wanted him to wear a scarf, and they sent a bunch of wool to, I think it was a knitter named, I think her name was Bergonia Pope, if I remember correctly. And they basically told her, make us a couple of scarves. Well, she misunderstood the instructions. So she made one really long scarf. I think it was like 12 feet by the time it was over with. 12 to 16 feet, I can't quite remember. But the scarf's a wonderful sort of accident. But it became a trademark. It became a trademark. It was, Tom Baker's Doctor, teeth, curls, and scarf.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.